The other day I was reading the gospel passage from Mark, the one where Jesus returns to his own hometown, and I think we all are familiar with the story. In fact, even if you're not a regular churchgoer, you probably are familiar with the story, because basically what happens is the local people can't really commit with much faith to what's going on. They know him as Jesus, the carpenter's son. They probably know all sorts of other stuff about him as well, and some of them may well have known him since he was a very young boy, and this becomes a stumbling block. And the scriptures tell us in Mark's gospel that Jesus did not perform a single miracle there because of the close-heartedness of the people that were in his hometown. And I had a bit of an epiphany reading that passage, because what we tend to do, and this is now such a common thing that it's actually a colloquialism widely used in circles all over the place in the West, whether it's politics or a family gathering or the workplace, this whole idea of a prophet is never respected in his own hometown. We generally think of ourselves as being a substitute for Christ in that particular moment. When we use that particular colloquialism, we tend to think, oh yes, I am the prophet, I'm not respected, people don't really see me for who I really am, they're missing all of the important stuff about me, etc., etc. But the epiphany I had the other day was, perhaps we shouldn't be doing that. Perhaps instead of thinking primarily about ourselves and putting ourselves in the place of Christ when we hear that particular passage, perhaps instead we should actually be putting ourselves in the place of the doubting townspeople, the people from Christ's hometown who look at him and they have skepticism and they don't see what is really going on in their midst because all the other stuff's getting in the way. And it struck me that there's two ways that this probably commonly happens in our lives that we just take for granted and aren't really paying enough attention to. Firstly, in our own lives, perhaps we miss the way in which God is at work because all we're seeing is the stuff that is overly familiar to us, and we're not recognizing the way in which God is actually at work, even in the midst of the familiar stuff and the messy stuff and the brokenness. And another way I think in which this happens is the people who are closest to us. We fail to recognize the way in which God is doing profoundly good things in and through those people because we are just so overly familiar with them that we know all their faults, we know all their imperfections, and we become fixated on those instead of seeing the grace of God at work in those people's lives. There's a beautiful principle in Catholic theology: grace builds on nature. And so God's ordinary way of working is to have an outpouring of his grace on top of the natural stuff that's already going on in our lives. But I couldn't help but wonder when I was reading this passage again the other day, how often do we fixate on the natural with those who we are most familiar with, including our own lives, and as a result we fail to actually see the grace that is at work, and we take that for granted. And maybe we're looking for big miraculous moments or big signs or big things that are out of the ordinary, when the whole time God is at work in our lives and we're not seeing it because we're too fixated on the stuff that we're overly familiar with. And I think the challenge for all of us, and I include myself in this, is to actually stop and to actually remind ourselves, to practically tell ourselves, hey, stop and consider and think about the way in which God is actually at work right now in the situation that maybe you are not seeing because you are one of the people in Christ's hometown who has become too overly familiar and is perhaps not seeing the many beautiful and wonderful ways that God is actually at work in your life or the lives of those who are closest to you.